Okay, well, this is going to be a great panel here. So the premise behind this panel is Forestry 2040, action required. And the panelists we have here are leaders, mid-career leaders in forestry. And so the idea is we look back on the last 20 years of our experiences and then draw upon those last 20 years of experiences to look forward at the next 20 years. What do we expect to change, both from forestry professionals and forestry institutions, right? Forestry as a profession. And then tying that all together with what are we working on now that is laying the groundwork for that potential change. I'll do a brief introduction to the panelists, but I won't go through their entire bio. I'm hoping that you'll get a sense of who they are as we kind of go through our questions and answers. I don't want to bore you too much with, just reading too much right up front here. Start with Ara Erickson, who is the Director for Corporate Sustainability at Weyerhaeuser. I'll do a little bit here on education, has a master's degree in forestry from University of Washington and a bachelor's from UC Berkeley. Terry Baker is the CEO for the Society of American Foresters and was a leader within the U.S. Forest Service for a long time and experience all around the nation. He has a bachelor's degree in forest resources from University of Florida, master's degree in forestry from Yale, and a bachelor's degree in agricultural sciences from Florida A&M. And then Andrés Holz is assistant professor of geography at Portland State University and director at the Global Environmental Change Lab. And he has a bachelor's in forest engineering and a master's degree and a PhD. So like the education level, the experience level of the people on the stage I'm honored to be a moderator for this panel here. This is really great. So I have a set of question prompts. What I'm hoping is it'll be a pretty interactive conversation where you're part of the conversation, but of course, just like the other panels, not taking questions directly from the audience. Hopefully, we'll have some time afterwards if you have questions to contact us one-on-one. So the first question we have, or that I'll be asking these panelists, is looking back. So, we're all leaders in the forestry profession, right around the midpoint of our careers. And so looking back on the journey that's brought us to this point, tell us about the biggest lesson you've learned. And the biggest lesson about the nature of forestry work, the nature of forestry professionals in the field. And I'll go with whoever is the most excited and eager to answer the first question.
I'll start with this one.
Yeah?
I'm always excited and eager. Those of you who work with me probably get bored of that. When 20 years ago, I'm going to start with a story. I graduated from UC Berkeley, and I recognized that we were recruiting mostly students from rural communities of California who kind of had grown up in forestry or knew somebody in forestry, parents or siblings, and so that's who was sort of in the forestry program. I came from Southern California, where forestry was definitely a bad word, not something that our family practiced, and so I thought, well, how do we get other students into this profession and this field that I had fallen in love with, sort of had stumbled into? And I pitched to the school university faculty that I should do we should actually do outreach programs in the Oakland and East Bay area. And they said, okay, sure, we'll give you a little bit of money. Go out and see if you can get some students into our program who don't always look like everybody else. And I went into these schools and high schools and quickly realized that we had not created, and Terry and I were talking about this in the car today, we had not created a place for students or for anybody who really wasn't part of forestry to come into, to feel comfortable to be there. This was 22 years ago, and we're still there, and we're still trying to figure out how do we create a community and a sector and a field that really welcomes a diversity of people and backgrounds and colors and races and genders, and that they can really thrive. And I think, looking back, it's how do we get new ideas and new perspectives into something that's a challenging and often kind of can feel isolated field. So I would say that's been looking back 20 years, we're still trying to work through that. But if I had known kind of now what I know now, I feel like I would have approached those conversations with those high school students completely differently. Instead of trying to talk about all the benefits of forests, we would have quickly talked about what do forests mean to them, what do they want out of forests, how do they see their lives connected or related to forests, and if not, what would they like to know about them? We maybe would have had a different approach.
Sure. I'll go next. So I'll share a story, a personal story as well. And I think I look back and similarly, so to a certain extent, I may have been one of the students that we were trying to talk to.
But you made it.
But I made it. So I'll give you a fun tie, and that's not quite the tie you think it is. So I'm originally from a part of the country that I affectionately and folks from that area refer to as LA, but it's not Southern California. It's Lower Alabama. It's the Panhandle of Florida. So that's home, and definitely forestry is a significant part of that part of the country. But I grew up there and enjoyed forest, went out hunting with my grandfather, went fishing, all the normal forestry kid things. And I never knew the profession existed. I never knew that one of the largest national forests east of the Mississippi existed. And it was through a very kind of intentional, almost random set of acts that ended up connecting me to the U.S. Forest Service, and then an internship opportunity where I fell in love with the profession of forestry and fell in love with the U.S. Forest Service at that time as a potential career. And it was really interesting that I graduated from high school on Friday night, and on Monday morning I was driving 45 minutes to start work. And in true Forest Service fashion, my supervisor didn't expect me for 2 more weeks. And so then it's like, what do we do with a new intern? And lucky me, the Forest Service had just minted a brand new forest plan for the Apalachicola National Forest. They're like, hey, you should read this. Where most folks were using it as a doorstop, and it was still in the shrink wrap. But I did, and it was actually, at the time, being 18 years old, this was like the worst thing that you could have done to a high school graduate. And but now it taught me all the things that I didn't know, all the terminology, all the things around what uneven age management versus even age management, multiple use, all these different things that I would have had no clue. And the running joke was that basically I spent the rest of the summer being the walking forest plan. Even the folks who had written it had forgotten what they wrote over like 4 or 5 years. And they're like, Terry, what does the forest plan say about this? I'm like, didn't you write this? But that's part of my personal story, but it's also very telling, to be in those rural settings that normally that's where the forestry kids come from, and to not know. And so that was one of the things that I made different efforts while I was going to college to actually go back and talk to family members and friends. And it was interesting to just get their response. And some of the students were interested. They were interested in the scholarship. They were interested and curious about the opportunity. But what I learned, which may be jumping ahead to your question, but I learned that the parents, the grandparents, they didn't know it, they didn't trust it, and they were not okay with it. And so it was one of those things where there was this whole familiarity piece that needed to be worked through, and really more so than anything else, just trust. There wasn't a trust that this was a viable career, that this was a viable option for their children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews. And so it was really, really telling as I worked through that time very, very early in my career, just being excited about what I just learned and trying to share it. So it's really fascinating, and I look forward to the different ways I continue to engage in that work and talk with folks and try to just help set the example that these opportunities are out there, and folks want those voices in the room and want that experience and that background. And just look forward to different ways we can try to facilitate that in this role in SAF in the time that I've been here. And I'll close this quick comment with one of the more telling things. So I had that whole experience as a young person. I recently gave a talk last weekend, actually, and part of that talk they had me speak with an urban podcast as a way to kind of define themselves. And when they had me fill out the little information card of like who do you work, what's your name and who do you work for, and I gave them a little sheet, and they said, so I read Forester. I'm assuming you have nothing to do with Subaru, so what does a forester do? And my response was, I'm going to use that a lot over the next couple of years. But that's a reality that we face as a profession. And it's great to laugh at it, but it's also kind of this very kind of sobering reality that's the extent. You Google forestry and you get a Subaru. So it's an interesting lesson learned at the same time.
Thanks, Terry. That's interesting. How about you, Andrés?
For me, having grown up in Chile, which is a country that relies primarily on natural resources for their economy, was I went to college in the early 90s, where forestry was not a bad word yet, but it was being transformed. From my experience being here in the Pacific Northwest for the last 10 years and also in the US for perhaps the last almost 20, and sometime in Australia that I spent there too, I saw this word and this concept and this profession being transformed almost simultaneously. So it was very interesting to see how, and also the comment of gender ratio that was done before, we were 140 freshmen, 5 women. And it was a very harsh, difficult program to finish, to accomplish. And from being very positive, to a great extent perceived as a field that brought goods and economic growth to the country, we start learning little by little about the consequences on water, biodiversity, and how then the program trying to adapt to those new findings, and then how enrollments start declining, and how then programs globally, I would say, start adapting and trying to really think outside of the box and the longer tradition, and be more creative, maybe focus on things that we all care. So I see that as a change that is happening very rapidly in the last 20 years.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, and so, those, it sounds like coming from very different backgrounds and very different experiences, the lessons that we're learning kind of have, there's a common theme running through them. Now, I wonder about motivation, like inspiration, the fire. We heard about that on the previous session, the fire that burns, what gets you out of bed, what keeps you moving. And so question here, you're reflecting back on your initial motivation, what brought you into the profession? And then, where did that passion come from? And then also think about where you are now. Like, is it the same thing that's motivating you now that was then? And how has it changed and why? I mean, I guess that's kind of the core of the question there. No necessary order, right?
I could start.
Go for it.
Yeah. So to me, as a student, asking too many questions and complaining about teaching methods and why are we need to memorize this and who cares about this, and into thinking about gaps between professors and scientists and the real world, and now here I am as a scientist, as a professor. I've come around to really make a concerted effort to try to collaborate with community members, stakeholders outside of academia, to try to really tackle problems that we all care about and that have multiple amazing scientific validity and interesting questions, and also being very annoyed about the maybe what is the right word, the actual list of things that as academic we need to accomplish in order to get tenure, for instance. And none of them relate to our urgent problems that we have. Mm-hmm. And we need to think about those more critically and make a list of incentives, that's the word I was missing, that actually is much more in tune with our social ecological problems and urge that we have today. So that's my passion.
So it's finding answers to these big, important questions.
Yes.
Interesting, okay. How about you?
Yeah, so I go back to, I grew up in Southern California, I mentioned, and my father was a pretty staunch environmental activist, and some of my earliest memories, one of them is being on his shoulders at a nuclear power plant demonstration, or a protest that was Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. And there was this line that was drawn that if you crossed it, you got arrested. And I sat on my dad's shoulders and I watched people get arrested and was terrified that that was what my dad was going to do, which he did times not when I was on his shoulders, fortunately. But I grew up in the sense of there were these dire things that we needed to be addressing in the world, and they were incredibly important, and we needed everybody there. But I didn't want to be in a space where it meant that we were so close that we were up against a line that we had to cross, and there was really a this side versus that side. And so although I grew up in that space, I didn't want to be in that space. I didn't want to be at the place where you were literally head to head with each other. And so when I went into college, I wanted to do something related to the environment. And that there weren't a lot of places to be. There was environmental science where you measured water or things, little biological things, and it was too sciencey, and there was environmental policy, and it was just kind of too policy-ish and didn't feel real. Math at UC Berkeley, I wanted to maybe be a math major. It was way too hard, like too many brilliant people. I was not at that level. And a friend of mine said, you should come to this forestry class, this forest economics class. I think you might actually like it. And it might be this place where you could maybe dive into the policy and the people and the science all in one thing. And I went in, and as anyone who kind of went to forestry school, you fall in love with it, of the complexity of the things that you're trying to address, and the forests that we are fully intertwined with and need us and we need them. And forestry really allowed me to experience that. And then you go to forestry camp, which is those of you like band camp, but for like tree geeks is what I like to call it. And it was that place. And I think the earlier talk of sort of science, you're using science and then you're practicing in art. And that has still kept me motivated today. And so still in my job today, I prefer not to go to our environmental NGO friends at the line where we're having to figure out who's going to cross the line or not, and find out what is motivating all of us and what do we want from forests. And so I still kind of keep that image in my head as, how am I going to understand the other perspective? How am I going to understand the complexities of being a large private landowner is different than a small landowner, but maybe there's something that's similar. And what are those similarities and what are those common places that we can, we're not going to agree on everything, and nor do we need to be doing exactly the same thing. But where are those things that we can do together that make sense, that make it so we aren't having to constantly be forced to cross a line?
Wow. Yeah. Well, how do you follow that?
I'm certain you can, Terry.
So I think that, when I first came into this, again, it was a lot more curiosity than anything else that was a driver, but the more I learned, the more curious I became, the more I enjoyed it. And I think one of the things that really encapsulated that, not just being outdoors and getting things done, which was always exciting to me, which was this sense of community. Within the profession of forestry, there's this definite sense of community because there's a set of unique shared experiences. I mean, most professions have these, but it's interesting within the field of forestry for me, because it's that whole concept of, oh, you're an undergrad, well, what are you majoring in? Forestry. Oh, you're going to be a park ranger. Or you go to the financial aid office and they're like, forestry, we have that here. I mean, there's these things, but I can say it and you all laugh because you're like, yep, that happened to me, or that happened to someone who I knew. And so there was this interesting, almost community of outcasts that you might call it. And it was, but it built such a strong community around itself, and that everyone wanted you to be successful. You wanted to learn from each other. You took pride in what you did, and there was a certain sense of just being part of something that other people weren't quite aware. Like there was the panel before us, in Act 2, Women on Fire, there was this whole concept of the hero mindset. Mm-hmm. And I think to a certain extent, it's not quite the level of being a hero, but it's this whole sense of working for the greater good, even though society doesn't know you're doing it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a really interesting mindset that most folks who go into this field, that's part of the initial driver. But I do think that sometimes what happens as we go through and we do those stair step of things, that this is the list of things you have to do to be successful, or to gain tenure, or whatever it might be, we get lost in the technical details. And so one of the things that I definitely experienced working here in the Northwest, I spent about 5-6 years as a district ranger in McKenzie River. I learned a lot. If you want to actively manage forests in McKenzie River, you learn a lot about people. And as well as, I wasn't a district ranger, but I was a forester down in Ashland, Oregon. You learn a lot trying to manage the Ashland watershed. But it's this whole concept of there's so much pride in all that you have to learn, all that you have to experience and to a certain extent endure in the harsh weather conditions that you work in, that you forget to talk about the things that you value. So when someone stands across from you, stands at that line, and they're just sitting there saying, you're a terrible person, or how do you look at yourself in the mirror, or you don't know how to manage my watershed, the instant response is to either become defensive and or to talk from a place of, well, here are all the facts. Here's the science behind why I'm doing what I'm doing, and you don't know what you're talking about. Versus, here's why I got into this. This is why I value this watershed the same way that you do. Even though I may not have grown up here, I have a certain sense of value and importance of this watershed. Because what that does is that creates this place of value and commonality between the two of you. In that moment, you create community. You create the same community that all of us have. But it's from this place of, why do you value this versus, here's the science behind why I'm right. You know, so it's that piece that that I learned definitely here in the Northwest with some interesting projects, but it's this piece that's definitely stuck with me when it comes to some of the conversations we have about managing forests and how foresters and natural resource professionals communicate with folks that don't have the background that we have. But they say they have the same passion, the same values, and sometimes we can get lost in the fact that it becomes adversarial quickly. And to be able to step back and talk to a place of value can make a complete difference in that conversation.
Well, and the part about motivation, I guess, one of the things that you said there struck me about when you have a public meeting and they're attacking your intentions.
Yep.
And it's hard not to take that personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, I mean, how do you stay motivated through that to continue? Like you're on this, you talked about this hero mission to do good things for the greater good, but people don't necessarily recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you get through that and continue that mission in the face of these people that are attacking your intentions?
I think there's a couple of different ways. One in particular, for me, in specific situations here in Oregon, it had to do with my staff, is that I just had a really great group of people, and I wanted them to feel, not only be successful from the place of completing a project, but to actually feel successful. And so that constant push to develop these relationships and develop this understanding was one of those key pieces. I will say that probably another way that I look at it is probably a very interesting way, and we'll see how this sits with folks, and that is, I don't know if you've noticed, I'm African American. Shocking to some people. And these are like African American forester, like really? But and I'm an African American forester from the South. So I've experienced things in my life that a lot of people haven't, and hopefully won't ever have to. But part of what that teaches is that ability to respond not in the moment, and not to take it personally. You know, to have folks say things about you and know that they have no idea who you are. And so that, for me, gives me a certain mindset when I end up in those places that are very, combative. And I've had folks read Bible verses to me at public meetings. I've had folks, just flat out yell at me or question my character as a person. And I know that person doesn't know me. But for a lot of us who get into the field of forestry and natural resources, that's not what we signed up for. We didn't sign up to be yelled at. We didn't sign up to have people say, you're doing this project and you're, intentionally trying to destroy a community. And so it's an interesting lens that I end up bringing to the jobs that I've had, because I've experienced this just in life, let alone as a professional. And so it allows a different response in those moments versus kind of being overwhelmed by the moment. And so the motivation just comes from it not being foreign and knowing that you can move past it because it's not really directed at you.
Yeah, and I know, in my perspective, or from my experience, I had to kind of distance myself from the ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're starting to play with the ideas, regardless of the source,
Yep.
but not have personal, not allow your identity to be intertwined with the ideas.
Exactly.
And that helps, but it was a long transition, a lot of pain to get to that point.
So
I wonder
true.
if you've had any similar experiences, Aria? Or we're a little off script here. But
Yeah, I like it. I like
intrigued.
going off script. I think that the sense of sort of, I'm going to go with what you were just going with, that when we show up to the thing that we care about and feel strongly about, and when we show up to that space at work or in our profession, and we sort of bring our hopes or our dreams for that system, whether it's a social system or a biological system, and we want to manage it or help it somehow, we are going to bring ourself into it. We're going to bring the things that we want and we hope. And then we're all in these, we have boundaries around us, sort of guardrails where we can operate. And if those guardrails allow you to still kind of I'm going to grease the skids with your own passion, then it's good. It works well. You feel like I can take what I'm passionate about. I think I know a direction we can go generally. I have the right boundaries to kind of hold me so I don't go completely off rail. And I think where we start to run into issues is either those guardrails are unclear and you don't know that you crossed over one because no one told you or helped guide you, or the guardrails change dramatically. And I think we're in a space right now, I think we started off today's session, someone said we were at the inflection point, and there are so many things changing around us that those guardrails are changing every day. And so the motivation is still there. Like I think anyone who comes here on a Sunday, like we're motivated about something. We care about something, we're passionate about something. It might be something different than anyone next to you. But you're here and you know where you're going and you can see these big changes. And how do we together figure out what those guardrails need to be so that those of us who are in professions can kind of keep moving towards something without sort of falling off the rails? And I think when I have fallen off the rails or I've gone off the rails and I haven't felt supported or I haven't even known where I'm going, that's where the personal kind of drive starts to get mixed up with what I'm allowed to do or not allowed to do, and that's when it hurts the most. It's when you fail the most, it's when you hit the ground the hardest, it's when you feel the least or the most sort of like you're hanging out on that cliff. And so I don't know that the motivation sort of disappears ever, but I think sometimes it's better contained than other times.
Yeah.
Does that answer
I
that?
relate to that a lot.
Yeah.
Sure. Now, Andrés, I don't have as much experience on the academic side of the profession, but I wonder if you have any thoughts that would relate to that.
Yeah, for a while, and I think still, again, I would go back to my experiences in Chile, in southern Chile and Australia. There were the yes or no's, and there was no dialogue. There was a forestry with, in our case, plantations from pines, radiata pines and eucalypts, or there was no forestry, no management, and no management. And so from being at one end of the extreme, perhaps, on the no management, I've walked closer into degrees of gray. And so when in the past, now I was perhaps pointed by folks that were on the Viva forestry of plantations, and I was on the other end. Now actually I'm pointed by both, because I'm saying all the time, well, actually it depends. It depends, and it depends, and let's talk, and try to remove it, your strategy of remove it from me into what it's closer to us, into our emotions and what we care, and very soon we find common ground. Mm-hmm. And I start from there into building consensus.
Yeah.
And so I use that same analogy, that same strategy, and climate change deniers and things like that. So
Yeah,
yes.
it seems like it's so much easier to just align yourself with your personal bias and just simplify everything through that lens than to really be open to the diversity of opinions that are out there. That's so much more of a challenge, but it seems like it's necessary for this kind of a job.
So I just heard a joke on Tuesday. I was at a volunteer event at Habitat for Humanity, and my colleague and also a dear friend of mine from grad school told the light bulb joke, like how many economists, she's an economist, how many economists does it take to change a light bulb? It depends. And I said, well, wait, that's also foresters. Because it depends. It depends what your objective is. It depends what you're trying to manage for or make a decision about. And I love that we don't give enough time to allow people to say, it depends.
That's such a frustrating answer, though. You go to an expert, ask
Yeah,
them for
it
advice,
depends.
and they say it depends, and oh.
But it's true, and so that the space, if people are comfortable in being able to say it depends, and then being willing to listen to all the depends, maybe we can change a lot more light bulbs together.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit here for time, and I want to talk about kind of uncertainty in our jobs. You know, like we go through school and we're taught, you take classes and you're tested on things, and these are facts, and you're taught that they're true. And then you get out in your career and new science comes out, and new understanding comes out, and you find out some of it's not quite as true and some of it's totally wrong. And that actually our knowledge, right, the collective knowledge of what's true and what's not is always evolving. It's dynamic. It's never been static. So I wonder if you guys have examples from your career of things that you were taught early in your career that as your career evolved, you found that they weren't true? And then how do you recommend for young professionals, people that are kind of aspiring to follow in the footsteps that you're laying down, like how do they deal with that uncertainty? You know, knowing that not everything you're being taught today is going to be proven to be true in the long run.
So we all took a deep breath at that one.
Sorry.
I could start with the first question.
Yeah, sure.
So I was taught that there were some skills, some tools, some analytics that were silver bullets, that we could apply them, and you said before, one single answer, one single approach. And that's definitely not true. And that definitely brings a challenge, that we have uncertainties, that we have unknowns, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. That doesn't mean that we cannot try them. If anything, be comfortable giving up something that you give it for granted, and push it. I try to push in my brain that I have to be comfortable relearning something new, because what I thought was okay, it's wrong, or not completely right, and the tools that I was comfortable using are dated. And so being comfortable at being uncomfortable on a regular basis, it's challenging, but that's what I see that is going now to the second question of how do we need to train people, is to get used to reinvent themselves in many ways, including training.
Wow, that seems like a challenging thing to train somebody to do.
It's
like
it,
the,
well,
like the
it's.
part you said about,
I mean,
be
it
comfortable being
sounds.
uncomfortable.
It's like a conversation that the global fire, but the actual solutions are not that complicated. It's, for instance, where you're teaching a class on, I don't know, GIS, computer programming. You could say, by the way, for the next 5 years, this might be useful. Later, maybe not. I mean, so you're already giving uncertainty into the students to get used to, like, I'm gonna have to do my homework here, and so.
Yeah.
Well,
Do you have any examples?
you give a great example, because when I was an undergrad, I had a professor that had been teaching ecology and a few other subjects for many, many years. And so half of our GIS class was photogrammetry. And, you know, the headaches, the cross eyes, the whole thing.
Little dots.
And, you know, at the end of like literally half the semester, he's like, you know, you're never going to really have to use this in your job. You know, now let's go to the GIS lab. And so it was one of those things where it was that first lesson and like, so why do we do this? And I mean, it was that whole concept of like understanding kind of where the evolution of the technology and what it's used for. But I think it's a great example of that concept, that it's going to constantly evolve and change. And I make efforts to engage with students and mentor students constantly. And some of the things I tell them, especially forestry students, because I saw it, not just with that class, but I saw it in a few other classes from the standpoint like, our professors wouldn't use a single book. I don't know how many of you had this, but it was just like, well, I like this chapter from this silviculture book, I like this chapter from the, you know, and it's just like, you were just at a reading packet, because there was no, this is the standard, this is what you use. And so when I talk to students, I always say, you know, you're learning the basics, and take it from the standpoint of you're learning the basics. Wherever you work, they're going to teach you how to do inventory their way. You know, and so you cannot be married to what you learn in just the way, you know, like that you learn in class, because it's just going to be different. And I think it's really important, that whole concept of being, you know, comfortable being uncomfortable, and maneuvering through your career. And you know, for me, I've had a career of a lot of times, it's not the stuff you learn in the classroom, you know, but you're expected to have a cool, calm head. And a great, one of many McKinsey stories is like, we almost had a baby born in the office. And I was a district ranger, and people were like, well, what do we do? And I'm like, how would I know? This was...
Well,
I took forest mensuration. I did not go to like pre-med and have any idea how much warm water and the blankets and all the things that we need. But I mean, that literally happened. And so there's these whole concepts around the things you just don't know. And that's a bit of an extreme example, but there's so many real examples. I mean, I'm sure everyone in here has a story about you came across something in the woods that was never part of the conversation when you were taking a forestry class. And you had to figure out how to deal with it. Maybe dealing with it was just turning around and going the other way. In some cases, maybe you didn't have a choice. So it's that whole being comfortable, being uncomfortable, I think is really at the core as you deal with more people in forests.
Yeah. But you are.
Yeah, I had my graduate student professor or graduate school professor, Gordon Bradley at University of Washington, gave me like the best advice when I was trying to finish my thesis, which has carried me on into my career, which that I was studying urban forestry, and I was looking at sort of street tree conditions in different neighborhoods in Seattle, and I was deep in the analytics of it, and he said, Ara, no one's going to read your thesis. Other than the review committee. And he said, if you're getting a PhD, it's a little different. But he said, you're going to write it, I'm going to read it, you're going to defend it, it's going to go on a shelf in the library. If somebody reads it, you're going to bow down to them. And sure enough, like 2 people have ever come back to me and said they read my thesis. But what he said is, we are not expecting you to be the expert in this subject right now. What we want you to do, for your master's degree at least, is to know how to ask a question, how to look at different information, how to come up with some type of conclusion, and also understand that there's probably 3 or 4 other ones. And what are the methods that you use to approach a challenge? And I almost cried to Gordon and said, I still have to write this thing? But I did, and I've carried I've carried that lesson throughout my career, is that I don't always know what the challenge is that's ahead of us, or even what we're supposed to be doing next. But okay, how do we understand what the problem might be? How do we frame it in ways that we can actually ask some questions about it? How can we dissect it a little bit? How can we learn a little bit more about it? And I've been really fortunate or unfortunate, depends, to be given a huge variety of different types of tasks and roles and jobs in most of the places I've worked. And it's usually because I'm willing to say, okay, what is our problem right here? What are we trying to achieve? How might I ask the questions so that we can accomplish the work? And just as a quick example, I was managing working on our sustainability program at Weyerhaeuser and doing some internal communications. And 6 months later, I was managing our headquarters move to downtown Seattle and sitting in the middle of these construction conversations and architecture conversations and picking furniture and doing change management. And the construction community would be like, what's your construction background or your project management background? Or you must have a design background. I was like, no, I have a forestry degree. And they would look at me like, are you driving a Subaru? But they couldn't understand how I was in this totally unique space. And actually, we did get the building built and we moved on time, and it was amazing and the hardest thing to do. But I just kept coming back to, what forestry teaches you? That there's always a bunch of different answers. There's always a different solution. You run into things you don't expect. And sometimes you need to back away, but you can go around it. And I felt like that lesson was I'm going to thank Gordon Bradley for that.
You got that.
He's
lesson.
not here, but if you ever knows him, let him know.
You got that lesson a lot earlier in
Yeah.
your career than you
It took some stumbles, but I remember.
Could I add one quick thing to that?
Yeah,
I think that the other thing that I've shared with a few students, and it's in that similar vein, and that is, if you're looking at your career, it's almost like going to college, and they're like, oh, you go to college to focus on something, but you kind of learn what you want to do along the way. I think even as you get into your career, if there's those opportunities to stretch yourself and do something completely different, that willingness, again, puts you in this mindset and have the people around you see you as someone who just wants to help make things work and is willing to try and do things differently for the sake of the organization, be it public, private, nonprofit. And I think that that's, above all things, that's an amazing skill to have, and it's a lot more rare than you might believe. And so that willingness to just say, like, you know what, I've got no idea what I'm doing, but I'm going to manage this move. Let's make it happen. For myself, 20 years as a federal employee, you're like, you know what, I think I can run SAF. All right, let's jump right in there.
I agree with you strongly about how rare those characteristics are in people. Like you think it's just abundant, right? There's that abundant willingness to go out on a limb and take risks, and it's not been my experience. And so we need to, we're trying to cultivate that out of the next cohort of people.
Most definitely.
So I want to pivot a little bit to kind of our current work, like what we're currently working on now. And so the question here is to have you briefly summarize the most important work you're currently involved in, but also why is it important? So what is it and why is it important? And I imagine there's going to be very different answers between you. I'm tempted to start with you, Andrés.
Sure. For the most part, we are working on trying to understand combinations between drivers of disturbance in nature and the impacts on things that we care, like water and forest and air. We have a number of projects, funded projects with federal, state, and NGOs, including the Nature Conservancy, for instance, that trying to look at how, for instance, how wildfires have happened in the past, whether there's severities. Can we assume that we have stopped fires everywhere? Or there are places that we haven't, for instance, in a gradient of moisture. We are here in the Willamette Valley, where we are aware that Native Americans burn a lot. But we're also aware that in the Western Cascades, there were little to no indigenous burning. And so those forests are not thicker now than they used to be 200, 300,000 years ago. And so how do we, now that we have a warmer climate and see these big fires, how do we respond emotionally? How can we inform those emotions to maybe be within bounds of science, of the best that we know at that time? In some areas where we see encroached forests because of fire suppression on the eastern side, for instance, and that we see more severe fires than we have seen in the past, some of those forests might not be coming back as forests anymore. What do we do about that? Do we replant? What species do we choose? Replanting means more fuels, warmer conditions, more severe fires? Do we want forests? Do we care about the species? Are we emotionally attached to individual species, or I want a forest? And maybe if I want a forest and I don't care about the species, it can still be a forest. If I care about the species, they might all die because of drought, because of bugs. So it's quite a challenge. And so I feel that we're asking very, not dull, but simple questions, because the challenge is huge. Mm-hmm. Try to really bring some brackets or bookend the complexities outside. Somewhere in there.
Does sound pretty important.
I guess I'll go next.
Sure.
Sure. Because I do not want to follow you on this one. It depends.
Oh.
And primarily depends because I have staff in the room, so I have to be very careful about what the most important thing is that I'm working on, and a board member. I think that, for me at SAF and being just over a year in, there's so many things. There's so many things that the organization does or has done or wishes to do. And I think for me, the most important thing is really asking, again, it's in its own way, it's a set of very complex questions or situations, and how do you simplify those? How do you really find out what the niche is in the way that you can support professional foresters in getting the education and information and that evolution of education that happens after you finish your degree to be able to continue to meet the needs of society. But I also think that there's a role that SAF plays with the profession of forestry and how it helps communicate on behalf of the profession and serve as that unbiased voice of 10,000 plus foresters across the country. And so thinking about how we best go about doing that, what does that look like? Is that just working in the policy arena? Is that working with educational institutions? Is that outreaching and engaging with communities and some of the normal communities, as we kind of say it, and then some of the not so normal communities? And continue to place that emphasis and create that normalcy, for lack of a better term, around forest management, where the first thing when you say I'm going to be a forester, people don't think of a Subaru, they don't think you're going to be a park ranger. They're like, oh, a forester, yeah, I've thought about doing that too. And those are some of the things that I really think are truly important, that at the beginning and the end of each day, that's what's resonating in my mind, is how do you draw that connection between the person who's actually out managing a forest and that mass timber building, and what that means and how people can see, and especially in this world of local sourced and where does your food come from? I heard from someone recently that I believe they work for BASF, and they're working on this what was it like, specialized cotton, and it's this big project, but you can literally go to your blue jeans and go to a website and find out about the farm where your cotton came from. You know, and so those are the types of things that start to resonate. You're like, if this is as big as it's really become within the U.S. and in the world about knowing where the things you use on a regular basis come from, then why aren't we doing this in the world of forest management and knowing where the wood comes from for your deck, or where the wood comes from for a mass timber building, or some of the other different resins and products that come from managing the forest. So it's really interesting to me that what does this communication look like? And in certain ways, how does forestry catch up with a lot of what's already going on in the world today?
Yeah. Wow.
Great. So this is a big question. There's a lot of things that are important in what we do every day, everyone in this room as well. So I've been spending a lot of my time in this nexus between what are forests going to look like in the future? And I think as foresters, we're actually we're ready, we're adapted. We're adaptive folks. We know how to plant different species when needed. We know how to we're learning how to introduce different disturbance regimes. From a biological perspective, I actually have a lot of hope that we as a community are going to know how to continue to grow forests and take care of forests in the future. Where I'm concerned is all of the systems that we rely on in order to manage these forests or harvest our trees or move them into mills or turn them into homes, those systems are going to be dramatically disrupted by a changing climate. And we are in a unique spot as a sector to marry those two things. How do we continue to have adaptive, resilient, healthy forests for many, many generations for our children to grow up with and their kids and on, at the same time having the infrastructure that's really needed for us to do all of that well. And that's out of our controls in many ways. But how can our forests then act as an incredible climate change mitigation part on the other side? So what are the roles of working forests, and in particular working for Weyerhaeuser? Of course, we're going to talk about working forests. What are the roles of working forests in this new world, both from the trees we grow, the forests we grow, the forests we manage, how we do that, how our mills are set up to handle extreme temperatures, where we've had people working where it hasn't been hot or cold in those mills, and now it is very hot or very cold. How do we harvest in changing weather conditions? So those are not things I can solve as an individual. That's not my job, but my job is to try to bring the importance of that into our company, and then make certain that aligns with our business proposition, and continue to move that forward. And that, to me, is one of the single most important things that I've been working on. We have a very unique role as working forests, and we are really challenged in how to describe that. And we end up too many times kind of fighting over little nitpicky details, and we lose sight of the fact that we have an amazing resource that, one, we can manage, need to manage, can provide a different solution than other types of forests, both in how they're managed and where they are, and then the products that we can create. And we have not figured out how to articulate that well, how to put that into the right policies, and then how do we as an industry, adapt to the entirely new world that we're going to be operating in, and a new operating space, both inside buildings and definitely outside of our buildings.
It's a really good segue as I see time slipping away, and we need to look forward at the next 20 years. So I guess we'll just go right there. What do you guys see as the biggest challenges and or opportunities we're going to face in the next 20 years? And for the profession and for individual forestry professionals? And then how do we what are we doing now to respond to those challenges? And then how are we laying the groundwork, right, to respond to those challenges? And then, and how do we prepare? I got stumbled up with it. Visioning for the future.
So I think I can number a couple of them off the top of my head that go beyond forestry. Climate change, artificial intelligence, urbanization and migrations and inequality, land use change. Those are things that to me are at the highest level. Thinking about forest, I think there are committed effects or committed impacts that we don't see already, that already happened. Mm-hmm. So there's a lag between our actions, our capacity to see things, and what's actually truly going on underneath. So those are huge challenges. My little contribution to that is try to train students, try to communicate to students the best, do events like this, where we can communicate our challenges, our visions, training students into interdisciplinarity. I think going back to the 20 years from the past, one of the challenges that I saw was communication skills from foresters with the general public. And so I make the joke, I was in a resilience panel with 35 academics, maybe 25. It took us 4 weeks to make sure that each of us understood the word resilient exactly the way the others were. And then we went to sustainability. And we all understand very different things. And so be open-minded and realize that we come from very different places, and be able to actually communicate it more effectively starts early, starts from education.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah.
Profound challenges you listed there. Like, as you're listing them off, my jaw drops farther and farther. Like, whoa, that's a lot. Well, obviously, we're not addressing all of those within forestry, but
Yeah.
in time, maybe.
Yeah.
But
Sure. I'll, Abe, I think the kind of the amusing way to respond to that question is, there are known knowns and there are known unknowns,
Right.
but there are also unknown unknowns. But the fact that when you say something like that, there are a few folks in the room that clicks with, and they start to pay attention a little bit differently. I think that's one of the realities, and it gets back to what Andrés was just saying. It's communication. It's been communication. It was communication when I was a student. It was communication long before I was a student. How do we have these conversations outside of ourselves? How are we able to communicate what we do and why we do it, to a different, basically a different audience? And what does that look like? And so I think that how we make information available, how we look to the ability of tying, climate change or a change in climate to mass timber buildings, or to, how you sequester carbon in those different ways in a forest, how a young forest sequesters more carbon, all these different things that intuitively, for most people who value a forest outside of forest managers, it doesn't make sense, because that's not where the value lies. The value lies in that mature forest that they see and that they love. And so how do we have some of these broader conversations? How do we look at these things where we have the ability to communicate and we have the skills to communicate? And I think that it's not just that we have the skills to communicate, it's also that we have some of the different players that are willing to communicate. So I think that oftentimes we talk about, well, we just need to teach foresters how to communicate. Like, and my first comment up here with Joe was, I didn't get in forestry to communicate. And most folks that I've met didn't get in forestry to communicate. And so if that's the case, it's not necessarily that it's always has to be a forester that's up in front of a crowd trying to tell the story, especially if that's what makes them uncomfortable. It's who are the people that are also very passionate, that are willing to gain an understanding that they can speak intelligently about this, who are the charismatic speakers that can get up on a stage. Jad Daly, it cracks me up that he was on the green carpet at the SAG Awards, and I'm like, the CEO for American Forest is at the SAG Awards, and it was after, I believe it was the Paradise Fire. But it was so fascinating to see that, and to say, that's a place you never thought you would see someone representing a forestry organization, is the Screen Actors Guild Awards, So those opportunities are out there, the interest is out there, it's our willingness to step into that space, or find the people who are in those spaces, or willing to step into those spaces for us to have the conversation. It doesn't always have to be us. It just can be someone who's willing to speak and who cares as much as we do. So I think that that's a big piece of it is, yes, there's that development of that skill set, but it's also how do we find the right partners who are in those spaces to help carry the message for us, that I think will be critical going forward in the next 20 years. And lastly, I think that also, when you were mentioning, students who are environmental science or, environmental policy versus the forestry and natural resource students, I think that there's a space there. I think that we don't create the narrative well around forestry. Oftentimes folks are like, well, what do you think of when you think of forestry? And I've seen the same things, like, oh, well, swamp men and axe loggers, because that's what was on TV. For the general person, for the general person who doesn't know, and what makes good TV, the fewest amount of fingers and teeth. So, but that's what they feel represents this profession. And is that a segment of the profession? Sure it is. But it's not all that there is. You know, you have utility foresters, you have urban foresters, you have GIS foresters, you just keep going down the list of all the things that foresters do across the country. And we don't capture those students from, you know, Los Angeles or from, you know, major metropolitan areas, downtown Portland, to be engaged in some form or fashion of forestry. We're still in that place of looking to mostly rural, you know, locations. And so our ability to start to have these conversations and say, no, this is as much of an urban challenge as it is a rural challenge, and also an opportunity. And your ability to step into that space and gain the tools versus measuring very small things or just talking about policy in a very ethereal place. Here are the tools to actually make the things you want happen.
Yeah.
And that's one of the greatest, you know, gifts, I'll say, that forestry can give us.
I like where you're talking about like the field of forestry, the disciplines necessary to implement the field of forestry is broadening and broadening as the data is more complex, the analytical tools are more complex, the problems are more complex, right? We need more talent from multiple different aspects, all supporting forestry.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I have a challenge. There's two, but they're related. I think our challenge over the next 20 years is how do we show the world that our toolbox is very diverse and very robust and ever expanding. So our tools that we're going to need to manage forests and live with forests and live with fire and live with the world that's coming at us is going to need so many different options, and we aren't great at getting a lot of options. I mean, we know there's options, but then we're really good at like refining one option. So how do we have all kinds of tools in our toolbox and earn the trust of the communities where we work around the world, especially in communities where people have not been treated as well, or provided those opportunities, and show them that there's a huge amount of tools, and we are open to a lot more tools. We're open to anyone's great tool idea to put into this toolbox to then use and try and practice, and do that really quickly. Like, we don't have 40 years to test out a tool. We have a year or two, but then someone's attention's going to go somewhere else. And so that the sort of broadening of a toolbox, I would say, that's what a challenge. But with that, it's about capturing people's hearts and imaginations and passion. And I think we struggle with using the word like beauty. Like, what's the beauty of wood or the beauty of forestry? We talk about the technical aspects. I was just in a car with a marketer who does a bunch of green marketing, and I said the word beauty of wood, and she said, that's it, that's your hashtag. You got to just do hashtag beauty of wood or beauty of forestry or beauty of forests. And that's what people want. They want something beautiful. They want something that they can connect with. That's what they want us to do as practitioners. And we show up with the science, and we show up with the technical, and we show up with the axe or the chainsaw, and they are just not beautiful. We can make them beautiful. We can make them look beautiful. We can make them gorgeous, and we can talk about them, about how great they are, but we don't do that. And so our challenge is going to be getting us to think more beautifully.
I like that.
And if you can add to the beauty, I think that using wood, using paper, well, paper maybe not, but using wood definitely is not going away. And learning how to gain trust, regain trust, have conversations, have a more depends, not zeros and ones, somewhere in the middle. The alternative is to go internationally and build wood or bring wood from other places that we know that the environmental standards are much lower. And so what are your choices? It's not just the US. And so the choices is probably your best bet if you want to really be in tune with nature and manage nature in a good way is to do it here when you have the resources to do it. So yes, I like the hashtag, and let's do it here.
Start today.
So yeah, we've got a lot more questions. I think we could go on for at least another hour, but we won't. Yeah, I guess I kind of want to sum up a little bit of what I heard today with Chris Dunn and the analytics and all the complexity, and you saw all that data and the overlap of all that data, and then the Women on Fire and bringing new ideas and new ways of thinking about the problem, and folks that weren't historically listened to, making sure their ideas are on the table. And then here, I like what we were saying here with what are really your options, and when someone's in a decision-making position, and you're in a technical position, what really are the options, and what are the trade-offs between those options? There may be a lot of options, and it may be very complex to evaluate the trade-offs, but the world's not getting simpler, and these problems aren't getting any less important. So, yeah, it seems like there really is a thread that runs through all of these talks today. But we could go on and on. For now, we're done. Thank you.
Thanks.